I'm John Batchelor with Gordon Chang, the Daily Beast. Gosh, there's a lot of stories when we go to Hong Kong, Gordon.
Yeah, there's too many.
We welcome Mark Clifford, former editor-in-chief of the South China Morning Post, a Hong Kong resident. We wish him a very good morning. When we spoke with Mark, moments ago, we immediately zeroed in on Edward J. Epstein's new book about Snowden and those days in Hong Kong that remain much in controversy. What did Snowden say? Who did he meet? What was going on in Hong Kong? Mark, I've come to understand that Hong Kong is the center of all the intrigue. It's the new Berlin. A very good morning to you. We go to an intriguing story in Hong Kong right now. Gordon, what is the background?
The background is that Beijing is trying to make sure that legislators who have an independence-leaning view are not actually seated in the Legislative Council, which is Hong Kong's, I guess city council is perhaps the best analogy. But it's clearly what's happening right now is that the Chinese are trying to strangle democracy at a very core point where you have people actually trying to sit in the legislature.
Good morning to you, Mark. Does this weigh upon the people of Hong Kong as we begin a new year?
Well, the new year started with somewhere between 4,000 and 9,000 people demonstrating in the streets against the Chinese government on exactly the issue that Gordon was talking about. There's a kind of slow squeeze on Hong Kong. Last year was a very tough year for pro-democracy forces in Hong Kong. Kidnapping of several booksellers at the end of the previous year, and then, as Gordon said, the continuing attempt to oust pro or independence-leaning legislators from our fairly powerless legislative council. But it's become a huge symbolic fight for Beijing and for the pro-democracy forces.
Mark, if Beijing did not try to unseat these legislators, it just, at least from a distance, it would indicate that these guys would have been marginalized anyway because they don't have as much support in the general population as they do now. And the reason why they have that support, it appears, is because they have become martyrs. Why is Beijing just so ham-fisted in this? They must know that they're doing everything to undercut their own position.
Gordon, I think that's a great question, and I can't speak for Beijing, but it's remarkable to me how in the space of 3 years they've created a movement in favor of some sort of independence, which seems preposterous, but it's got the support of somewhere around 20 or maybe even 25% of the population in surveys and, more importantly, in elections to put these so-called localist candidates who support local Hong Kong interests in positions of power. And as you say, it seems so unnecessary, so ham-fisted, but I think that Beijing is so unused to seeing any kind of opposition, and it's certainly the last 5 years of Xi Jinping's rule have seen a real rollback in terms of whatever emerging openness there was in China. And now Xi is getting ready for his second 5-year term, which by recent precedent should be his last, but doesn't look like it will be his last. So I think there's often an unwillingness or inability to really think about the bigger long-term strategic picture on the part of people in Beijing and to really focus on short-term tactical maneuvers, and in this case, trying to squelch any form of dissent in Hong Kong, which is particularly, Hong Kong is particularly unnerving to Beijing at a time when the Taiwan president, the new Taiwanese president, has taken a much more distant stance towards China.
There's a narrative that you suggested, which I think is so critical to understanding China these days. After the 1997 handover of Hong Kong from Britain to the People's Republic of China, the Chinese officials with responsibility for Hong Kong had a fairly light touch, much lighter than I thought that they would have. And essentially, things went along fairly well. You know, there were problems, but things were smoothed over. Now you have Xi Jinping, who is rumored to have the Hong Kong portfolio. He comes in with a tough guy attitude, really sort of tightening down the screws, and the whole place seems to go crazy. And that seems to be the result of Xi Jinping's tough approach to things. And I suspect that we will see this same dynamic that is now we can witness in Hong Kong. We're going to see this in the mainland itself. And as you point out, there is the issue of Taiwan, where you have many of the same issues come to the fore.
I agree completely. It's hard to know how this year is going to play out, but in Hong Kong, we're now looking at the re-election of what's effectively our mayor. We call him the chief executive. The current chief executive dropped a bombshell just before some elections last month by saying that he would not run for re-election. He said it was because of some family issues, but in fact, it's widely suspected that it's on orders of Beijing. And so now we have the prospect of a pretty wide open race, although we as Hong Kong people don't directly elect a chief executive. There's an election committee which has got a lot more pro-democracy voices in it than it did before. In fact, that election last month was for the election committee, and the pro-democracy forces did very well. So there's a very fluid dynamic, and of course we haven't even talked about the fact that there's a new president in the U.S. who's going to take office in a couple of weeks, and his approach to international diplomacy and his tweeting about China have, I think, really unsettled people in Beijing.
The young people who are protesting in Hong Kong, I see them because I watched the pictures over the years, and I believe it was 2 young people that are not being seated in the Ledgeco. Is this a generational divide, Mark? The millennials, are they just refusing to listen to Beijing, and that's the future?
John, that's an excellent point, and yes, it is. And I think that, again, has Beijing quite concerned and unnerved, because they thought that the post-1997 people, the millennials, really anyone who was young or not yet born at the time of the handover in 1997, would naturally gravitate towards the motherland. And although many of these people feel very proud to be Chinese, they don't make they do make a distinction between the Chinese Communist Party and China, and they have emphatically been saying they reject Communist Party rule over Hong Kong. They want the Communist Party to respect its pledge of one country, 2 systems, and to give Hong Kong a high degree of autonomy in running its own affairs. It has really thrown Beijing for a loop. You've got these guys in their 50s, 60s, sometimes older up in China making policy, and you have these younger Hong Kong people who say, hey, we don't really care about a British colonial legacy that you guys are going on about. We don't care about the opium wars of the 19th century. What we want is the ability to have opportunities in our own city. And the combination of this political squeeze from Beijing and something we haven't talked about, the lack of economic opportunities, the lack of real opportunities for advancement, and as in so many cities around the world, the inability to get on the property ladders has really given many of these people...
Mark Clifford, Gordon Chang, I'm John Batchelor.